They found it where the ground never fully dries, a circle of sharpened stakes hidden under a deadfall bark peeled back, tips stained the color of old iron, a quiet thing cruelly clever waiting in the hush of spruce and wet needles. When I close my eyes, that's the image that returns first, not the wind or the mountains or the faces we loved, just those teeth in the dirt patient as nightfall. Let me know where you're listening from, and share this if you believe remembering is the first step toward justice. Back then, my days were steady and unremarkable in the best sense. In the summer of '99, I lived in a cedar-sided rental east of town, a mile off Moraine Avenue, with a view that caught Long's Peak in the mornings when the air was 55 degrees and thin enough to ring like glass. I taught weekend CPR classes at the community center, tuned radios for the volunteer search team, and drank my first coffee of the day at the Timberline Diner, where the pancakes came bigger than your hand, and the short-order cook swore the griddle worked better in mountain air. By noon, I'd be at the Sayar shed, coiling rope or checking batteries, and by 5, I'd be home rinsing dust off my boots with the hose and listening to bull elk chuff down in the draw. Life moved at the speed of pickup trucks and porch talk. People waved with their whole arm. At the post office, you knew the order of the line by name, not by number. The rhythm around here is the kind that lets you hear tiny things, how the aspen leaves change their sound just before a storm, or how radio static gains a body when a ranger keys his mic from a long way off. By July, the daily thunderheads had settled into a routine heat by lunchtime, clouds piling like a slow train by 2, a sharp roll of thunder around 3:30, and rain so quick you could watch the steam lift off the parking lot by 4. The week before the hike, I ran into Elise Kensington at the grocery near the end of aisle 4, where they keep the soup and paper towels. She was reading the fine print on bug spray, the kind that promises the mosquitoes will give up and move to Kansas. She laughed when I told her not even DEET could make July gentle up here. Mara's crew is overprepared, she said, proud in that way mothers are when worry and confidence tie the same knot. Torin checked the stove twice. Leora labeled every bag, and Celine has half a pharmacy in her pack. The laugh stuck with me, bright and a little thin, like a bell rung from the far end of a hallway. I'd known Mara since she was a kid with tangled hair who chased grasshoppers at the church picnic. Art came to her easy. When she sketched napkins, church bulletins, the backs of receipts she didn't erase, she just laid a better line over the first and let the wrong one fade. The week of the trip, she showed me a small notebook with wildflower drawings along the margins, columbine, paintbrush, harebells. "I'm going to find a meadow by Sky Pond and stay long enough to draw it right," she said, the way people talk when they're young and summer feels endless. Leora carried a folded map, the way some folks carry a Bible. She'd laminated the route with clear tape edges, squared tiny notes in blue pen water. Here ice early, here step downs if wet. She'd weighed the packs on a bathroom scale and made Torin repack his because his stove fuel sat too close to the food. "We're 3 miles an hour on the flats, 2 on the climbs," she told me one evening on the sidewalk outside the library, the kind of sunburned precise that only long planning can make. She smiled when I reminded her that mountains don't read itineraries. Celine was quiet in the way of people who pay attention. You could tell she was listening by the angle of her shoulders. When the rest of the group joked about the heavy tent or the taste of instant coffee, she moved among them like a light held steady, filling water bottles, checking laces, tying the flat cord that keeps pots from rattling in a bag. Once at the Timberline Diner, while everyone else argued about whose turn it was to tip, she slid $2 bills under the sugar caddy and tapped my knuckles with the back of her hand. "For coffee next time," she whispered, and the gesture felt older than she was. Torin was easy to spot around town, tan forearms, bill cap pulled low an old Chevy with an oil-stained bed and a rope coiled behind the seat. He wasn't a bragger, but he had that looseness some mountain folks get the sense that if you toss him a problem, he'll bounce once and land on his feet. He'd tuned up their stove at my workbench the night before the hike hands, working without fuss flame, turning from orange to clean blue, with a little bit of coaxing. 20 pounds for the tent food's about 10 each to start, he said, whistling low, but I told them we'll eat our way lighter. He looked at the ridgeline like it was a familiar street and not a sawtooth that can change its mood in 10 minutes. The town carried them on the day they left. You could feel it. It was a Saturday sky so clear it made you squint already 68 degrees by 8 in the morning. I parked by the ranger station to drop off a battery charger, and there they were in the lot packs lined up like obedient dogs, water bottles, sweating sunblock shining on forearms. Leora held her map. Elise fussed with Mara's collar, like mothers have since the beginning of time. Celine laughed at something Torrin said, a sound that bounced off windshields and sounded for a second like a small bell. I asked them the only question I ever ask when someone I care about is about to head into the backcountry. "What's the plan if your plan fails?" Leora answered first. "We call by 6. If we're late, we camp closer. If we're hurt, we stay put." Torrin added. "And we don't pretend we're tougher than we are." Smart words that felt good in my ears. My life that day went on as planned. I loaded a crate of radios into the Suburban and drove them down to the shed. I helped a tourist from Dallas figure out why her rental car chirped like a cricket door ajar 8 of 10 times. At lunch, I ate a turkey sandwich on the tailgate and watched dust lift from the ball field behind the school. By 3, the clouds were piling as they always do, gray on gray, that low drummer's roll you can feel in your chest if you stand still. I checked the weather radio chance of storms over the Divide wind gusts 30 to 35, lightning after 2. In Colorado, that forecast means common sense. You drop below tree line before the sky turns the color of steel. You wait it out if you have to. Around 5, I drove past the Kensington house on my way to the hardware store. Elise had put a sticky note on the front door. Back by 6, call me the kind of optimistic reminder that belongs to a household where clocks still keep the day in order. Her porch smelled of pine cleaner and hot wood. The wind moved the chimes twice, then a pause long enough for you to notice you were listening. I told myself it was too early to be thinking about it, whatever it was. Day hikes run long all the time. A good view can steal an hour without asking. I spent the early evening on my own porch with a book I pretended to read, feet up on the railing, air cooling as the sun slid behind the shoulder of the mountain. Down in town, headlights moved like minnows along the curve toward the lake. Somewhere a radio played Merle Haggard too loud for the hour. The first bats came out neat little loops in the last light. I called a friend about flyline, laughed, and set the phone on the table. The first faint unease arrived, the way a draft sneaks under a door so slight you question yourself for noticing. I shook it off and told myself to wait until 6:30. People forget. People linger. People eat the second granola bar and talk until the light comes on in the valley. Just after 6, I stopped by the timberline to drop off a spare first aid kit for the owner's nephew. The cook asked if I'd seen the kids with the big blue tent. Headed out grinning, he said, "Scrubbing the flat top made me feel 20 again." I smiled and left a 10 by the register for coffee I hadn't ordered. The door banged behind me. The wind had shifted north and brought the alpine chill with it, the kind that slides down the canyon in the evening and tells you it's time to put on a sweater. I turned toward home and noticed the small things that make a place yours. The patched places in the asphalt. The cottonwood that drops too early each year. The old motel sign with the burnt-out O that reads pen. A buck stared from the roadside with that flat, unbothered look deer get near town. At the light, Ranger Holt crossed in front of me, in his green pickup, coffee tucked in the crook of his elbow, window down, radio crackling in a voice I knew as well as my name. He glanced over once and lifted 2 fingers in a silent hello. No hurry in him, not then, just a man driving home at supper time. By 7, the clouds had wrung themselves dry and left the air smelling like stone, sharp and clean. I started a pot of chili turned on the ball game low and stood in the kitchen without moving for longer than made sense. The clock above the sink hummed. I could hear the hum because the house had gone that quiet. I thought of Leora's laminated map and the neat arrows she drew the size of her handwriting when she wrote the word water. I thought of Celine sliding $2 bills under the sugar caddy and tapping my knuckles like we shared a secret. I thought of Torrin checking his flame and tightening the palm-sized wrench on the stove because good flame matters. I thought of Mara's sketchbook and the way she refused to erase choosing, instead to draw a truer line over the first. A little after 8, I stepped outside with the garbage and felt the temperature fall all at once like it does at altitude when the sun decides it's done for the day. A coyote loped across the road with the loose gait of a creature that belongs to the hour. Porch lights blinked on one by one along our street like a line of stars catching up to the sky. Somewhere in town a phone rang twice and stopped. Mine didn't. I sat back down on the porch and pressed my fingers against my wrist where the pulse runs and told myself a story about late dinners and long views and a car that takes the scenic way home. At 9, the Kensington porch light was still on. It burns a taut, clear yellow when Elise turns the dimmer all the way up bright enough that you can see the moths bump it and drift off. From my chair in the dark, I could picture that light steady as a metronome, timing a song only 2 people could hear, one in a quiet living room, one somewhere under a sky too big to measure. I checked my watch again and listened to the wind gather itself in the canyon. I waited another 10 minutes before I stood, found my keys, and told myself I was only going for a drive to shake off the feeling. The house settled behind me with one small pop from the cooling ductwork. When I opened the truck door, the dome light washed the seat in the kind of pale glow that makes everything look cleaner than it is. I sat there with the engine off, hands on the wheel, breathing the smell of dust and old coffee, and looked down the hill toward town. The street was empty. The porch lights held like small moons. The clock ticked. Somewhere up in the dark, thunder rolled once and wandered away. I started the engine and eased onto the road, telling myself I was only checking the time against the sky. At the first stop sign, I paused longer than I needed to and looked toward the valley where headlights should have been by then. The chimes on Elise's porch lifted once in the wind and went still again, and the yellow light over her door kept burning bright and patient, as if it could hold the highway open a little longer. I drove the back road toward the park that night, my headlights sweeping over empty pavement, a single moth batting against the windshield now and then. The clock on the dash showed 9:24 when I turned onto the road that runs along Fall River, the one that goes quiet once the last of the tourists clear out. The air had that thin chill that sneaks in after sunset, the kind that settles behind your ears. I told myself I was just taking a short drive to ease the worry, but my hands had already turned toward the ranger station before I'd made up my mind. When I pulled into the gravel lot, the windows were lit, and Ranger Holt's green pickup was parked crooked door still open. Inside, the radio hummed with static and low voices. Holt was leaning over the desk with his glasses off, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He looked up and said, "Mike, you heard from them." I told him I hadn't. He nodded once and said, "Neither have we." He was already making notes, times trail names, last check-ins. The tone in his voice wasn't panic, but there was an edge to it, a ranger who's seen enough to know when something's off. He picked up the phone and started the process. He probably hoped he'd never have to start again. Call the superintendent, get a unit rolling log, the missing persons notice. I stood there useless, just listening to the hum of the fluorescent light overhead. By midnight, the parking lot at Bear Lake was taped off the big floodlights, set up rangers with clipboards walking the perimeter. The hiker's car, a faded blue Subaru, was still parked in the same space where they'd left it 2 days before dusk on the windshield keys missing. Inside the trunk were empty coolers, a first aid kit, and a grocery bag with a folded receipt dated Thursday. Nothing else. Holt asked me to stay back while they went through the car, then walked over to Elise, who was standing near the barricade with her coat pulled tight, her arms crossed so hard her knuckles were white. She didn't say anything, just looked at the trailhead like she was trying to see through the dark. I knew that look. It's the look you get when your body already knows something your mind refuses to admit. By dawn, we were deep in the first phase of the search. Holt had pulled in 2 teams from Estes and 1 from Boulder, 10 volunteers, a pair of dogs, and 1 old Bell helicopter with faded paint. The wind came in heavy off the ridge, knocking the noise sideways so you couldn't hear your own boots on gravel. We split into quadrants, each carrying maps marked with red grease pencil. My team started up toward Nymph Lake, a 3-mile climb that feels longer when your throat's dry, and you can't stop thinking about what you might find at the next turn. I'd done this before too many times, but the difference this time was knowing their names, their faces. That changes everything. When it's someone you know, every scrap of fabric looks like a clue, every broken twig feels personal. The first day gave us nothing but silence. The dogs caught faint trails that led nowhere, one down to the creek bed, another toward a patch of dense spruce that swallowed sound. Around noon, a light rain started one of those quick, needling showers that make the rocks slick. We pressed on anyway. The clouds sat low, turning the mountain into a wall of gray. The helicopter passed overhead, twice the sound fading into the distance like a bad memory. By evening, we regrouped at the trailhead. Everyone looked the same, mud to the knees, faces streaked, not much to say. Holt leaned on the hood of his truck, wrote a few things down, then said, "We go again at first light." No speech, no comfort, just the routine that keeps you moving. The second day, we found something, a small strip of fabric caught on a root bright orange under the mud. I recognized it right away. Celine had worn an orange windbreaker the day they left. Holt held it in his gloved hand, quiet for a long time, then bagged it. "Could have blown off," he said, but neither of us believed that. The creek below was swollen from the rain, loud enough to drown your thoughts. We followed it until the slope gave out, then circled back. The water was cold and fast, milky from runoff. If they'd slipped in there, the current would have carried them far downstream. Still no footprints, no dropped gear, nothing. Just that single strip of cloth and a growing feeling that the forest had decided to keep its secrets. The families stayed near the ranger station that week, taking turns sleeping in the break room. Elise moved like a person underwater, slow, deliberate, her eyes fixed on the bulletin board where Holt posted updates. Every night she brought coffee for whoever was still out searching. Around the fourth night, she asked if it ever got easier. I didn't lie to her. I said no, but you get used to waiting. She nodded like she understood exactly what that meant. By day 6, the search had doubled. Rangers on horseback, volunteers with radios clipped to their vests, the helicopter doing grid sweeps. Nothing new. The weather turned again, wet snow, up high fog, down low. The cold made the air thick. Every breath came with a sting. Late that afternoon, one of the younger rangers, Naomi Reed, radioed in from a ridge 3 miles northwest of the main route. She'd seen something unusual in a clearing, something half buried under a log. Holt and I hiked up to meet her. When we got there, she pointed at the ground with her walking stick. At first glance, it looked like fallen branches arranged in a rough circle, but when we got closer, I saw the points sharpened stakes angled inward, each one lashed with vine. The wood was weathered but solid. Holt crouched down and ran a finger along the edge of one. "Not a campfire ring," he muttered. The tips were dark-stained. Could have been sap, could have been something else. Either way, it wasn't nature's doing. We marked the coordinates and swept the area around it. The ground was soft, from years of moss and rot. Under the nearest tree, we found a rusted carabiner tangled in Root's standard hiking gear, same type the group used. That was enough to get everyone's attention. Holt ordered the site, sealed off photos, taken samples, collected. Naomi looked shaken, standing there with her pack half unzipped, her breath showing in quick bursts. "Do you think they built it?" she asked quietly. Holt didn't answer right away. "Could be," he said finally, "or could be they found it." That discovery changed everything. The search stopped being a recovery and became an investigation. Forensics came up from Denver, their white suits looking out of place against the mud. They measured, photographed, scraped. The trap, if that's what it was, had been there a long time, years maybe. Still, the timing, the location, it was too much coincidence. News traveled fast. Reporters started circling. Elise saw the footage on TV that night and called me in tears. "They were right there." "Weren't they?" she said. I didn't know how to answer. When the lab results came back, the stain on the wood wasn't human blood, just iron oxide from soil, but the arrangement, the precision told another story. Someone had made it with intent. Holt went back through the old missing persons files looking for any crossovers, old camps, anything that could explain it. The trail where Naomi found the trap was off the main loop, a place few hikers ever went. I remembered walking it years earlier, back when you could still see remnants of an old prospector's claim, broken boards, rusted nails, a shaft sealed by time. Maybe it was connected, maybe not. But I couldn't shake the image of that circle of stakes, patient and hidden, waiting all those years. The next morning, Holt called in a new sweep this time, expanding north toward Flattop Mountain. The air was sharp, 40-degree sun low through the trees. Naomi was back out with us, quieter than before, but steady. Around mid-morning, her voice came over the radio again, calm but tight. "Got something else up here." We reached her in 20 minutes. She was kneeling by a patch of pine needles, brushing aside dirt with a small stick. Half buried beneath was a tarnished belt buckle, leather strap frayed but intact. She handed it to me. The maker's mark matched the one on the receipt from Mara's last shopping trip. I could feel my throat close. Holt bagged it, tagged it, then said, "We're close." That night the forest turned against us. The wind came hard out of the west, knocking limbs down, scattering debris. The helicopters grounded. We stayed at camp near the ridge, listening to the trees creak and pop. Around 2 a.m, I heard a shout from down the slope. One of the volunteers had tripped over something in the underbrush. We went down with flashlights, the beams slicing through the mist. In a shallow depression we found bones, small ones, too small for deer, too straight to be anything else. Holt crouched, jaw tight, then called it in. The forensic team was flown in at first light. We stood back as they worked plastic markers dotting the ground. One of the techs lifted a fragment of fabric with tweezers. Orange again, the same shade as before. The bones were scattered, maybe moved by animals, maybe washed down from above. We didn't know yet. What we did know was that this wasn't random. The mountain was starting to give pieces back, but only the kind that made you ask harder questions. By evening, the first DNA samples were en route to Denver. Holt didn't say much that night. He sat by the fire, hands wrapped around a tin mug, staring at the flames. "You ever feel like this place keeps score?" he asked. I said I did. Because I did. He nodded, then went quiet again. The following day brought more fragments: a torn scrap of tent fabric, a broken compass, a single hair tie tangled in roots. Each one felt like a whisper, as if the forest was telling the story in pieces, just to see if we were patient enough to listen. Late that afternoon, rain moved in heavy and fast, washing the soil downhill. Naomi noticed something glinting in the mud, a page half-buried, edges soft from time. She lifted it carefully. The handwriting was faint but legible. "Lost. Trap set. Help us." Leora's handwriting. I recognized it from a letter she'd once sent Elise, the same small, careful print. When Elise saw the photo of that page, she covered her mouth and sat down hard. It was proof that at least some of them had survived past that first night long enough to write, long enough to hope. For me, it meant the search wasn't over, not yet. If they'd written that they were alive when they found the trap, which meant there was more out there somewhere further in, something the forest still hadn't shown us. That evening I drove back into town for supplies. The sun was setting behind the peaks, the color bleeding orange, then gray. I passed the Kensington house. The porch light was still on. Elise was sitting by the window, staring out toward the dark line of trees that swallowed the horizon. I almost stopped, but didn't. There wasn't anything left to say. I drove on the road, curving through the valley headlights, catching bits of mist rising off the asphalt. The air smelled like rain and pine, and something metallic underneath it. When I got home, I spread the topo maps across the kitchen table, tracing the coordinates from Naomi's find to the site of the bones. The distance wasn't much, maybe a mile and a half, but between them was a stretch of terrain no one had cleared yet, a ridge leading into a basin marked only by contour lines and guesswork. If I'd learned anything in my years on these mountains, it's that sometimes the truth doesn't hide deep, it hides right next to what you've already found. I shut off the light, but sleep wouldn't come. Outside, the wind had gone still. The forest felt watchful again, the way it does just before a storm. I thought about the journal page, about those 3 words, "Help us." I wondered if they'd been written by flashlight or by daylight, if they'd believed anyone would ever read them. The next morning, we'd head for that basin, follow the trail north, see what else time had covered. But that night I sat at the table until the first light of dawn turned the window pale gray, listening to the house creak around me and the far-off murmur of the river. Somewhere up there in all that wilderness, their story was still waiting to be finished. The morning we went back up felt different, heavier somehow. The forest was quiet in that way it gets before rain, when even the birds hold their breath. Holt had mapped a new grid that stretched from the trap site up toward the northern ridge. Naomi and I took the lead boots sinking into damp moss radios clipped to our vests, the air thin enough that every breath felt like glass in your lungs. The ground there was uneven matted pine-slick rock roots that waded just under the surface. I remember thinking how fast a person could vanish in a place like that, even with daylight on their side. We'd been walking maybe an hour when Naomi stopped. She'd seen something in the dirt ahead, just a small glint under a layer of needles. She knelt down and brushed the debris aside with the back of her hand. It was a belt buckle, tarnished and dull, the leather strap nearly disintegrated. You could just make out the faint brand stamped into the metal, the same one Mara had bought before the trip. Holt came up behind us, squatted low, and took a long look before bagging it. He didn't say much, just nodded once like a man who's been waiting too long for something he never wanted to find. The find gave us direction. Holt ordered the team to push north another mile. The wind picked up, pushing the smell of wet soil and pine through the valley. Naomi took point, moving faster than before, the kind of focused that comes when you feel truth just out of reach. Around mid-afternoon, the light began to fade, that dim silver that hits right before a storm. We were cutting across a slope when I saw her stop again, one hand lifted. She was staring at the ground, and I'll never forget her face when she looked back at us. "Something's here," she said quietly. The earth was shallow and soft, like it had been disturbed once and then forgotten. Crushed ferns lay in a small hollow, and sticking out from the soil were what looked like bits of bone. They were pale smooth, too straight for animal remains. Holt knelt beside them, pulled on gloves, and began clearing away the dirt. A few minutes later, none of us had any doubts. Human remains, small fragments, ribs, maybe a partial jaw. He stopped working and stood up slow, rubbing his hands together like he was trying to wipe the years off them. We radioed it in, and within hours a forensic crew arrived from Denver. Watching them work under floodlights felt unreal white suits moving carefully between trees, the sound of camera shutters breaking the stillness. I stood a little ways back with Naomi, both of us silent. She had her hands jammed into her coat pockets, eyes on the ground. "You think this is one of them?" she asked. I told her I didn't know, but my gut said yes. The small size of the bones suggested one of the girls. Elise's daughter flashed in my mind, then her easy laugh, the way she'd talked about finding wildflowers to sketch. It hit me harder than I expected. The remains were bagged, tagged, and flown out before midnight. That left the rest of us standing under the trees with nothing but the sound of rain starting up again. I could see Holt under the tarp head, bent over his field notes, rainwater dripping from the brim of his hat. When he finally spoke, his voice carried through the static of the downpour. "We stay on it," he said. "We don't stop now." And we didn't. The next morning, the rain had softened the ground enough to show what had been hidden. Near the hollow where we'd found the bones, a thin scrap of fabric peeked through the mud orange, same as the one from before. Naomi spotted it first. She lifted it carefully, then froze. Beneath it was something else, paper soaked through edges curling. It took both of us to ease it out without tearing it apart. The ink had bled in most places, but one line was still clear enough to read "Lost." Trap set. Help us. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. It was Leora's. I'd seen it on the maps she'd made on the notes she left Elise. Holt just stared at the page for a long time, lips pressed together. That note changed the air. It wasn't just a discovery. It was a voice. Proof they'd been alive maybe even days after the storm. The rangers gathered around, speaking in low tones. Holt's orders came quick: expand the search radius, focus on the ridge. He wanted to find where they'd stayed, where they'd written that note. Somewhere out there was the place they'd waited for help that never came. We hiked higher that afternoon, following a narrow game trail that cut through spruce and granite. Naomi was ahead again, moving methodically, scanning every shadow. The wind funneled through the trees in slow, hollow breaths. About an hour in, she stopped near a cluster of rocks. Her flashlight caught something unnatural, a dark opening in the rock face, half covered with moss and branches. "Cave," she said. Holt and I joined her, ducking low to peer inside. The beam of my light fell on what looked like a makeshift camp. A torn sleeping bag lay against the wall, a rusted canteen beside it. There were scratches on the stone, jagged lines running in every direction, some deep, others just faint traces. I swept my light further inside and saw a photo pinned under a rock. Its colors faded, but faces still visible. The four of them, Mara, Leora, Celine, and Torin, standing shoulder to shoulder, smiling at the camera like they had the whole world in front of them. My throat tightened. Forensics went over every inch of that cave. They found bits of clothing, broken plastic from a flashlight, a single shoe with laces tied together. The scientists moved quietly, their voices hushed, as if speaking too loud might disturb whatever was left of those kids. Holt leaned against the wall near the entrance, eyes fixed on the scratches. "You see this?" he said softly. They were trying to count days, dozens of short, vertical lines carved in clusters, marks of waiting. Outside the cave, the rain returned steady and cold. We stayed there until nearly dark, taking photographs, mapping, documenting everything. The more we found, the clearer the story became, but it wasn't one we wanted to tell. These four had survived the first storm, maybe even days beyond it, hiding here, leaving signs for rescue. And then something happened, something that drove them from safety deeper into the wilderness. When we returned to the ranger station, Elise and the other families were waiting. Holt called them into the conference room and told them what we'd found, careful, steady, never promising what he couldn't give. Elise didn't cry. She just pressed her hand against the table and nodded like she'd been holding her breath for 7 years and had finally let it out. The next few days blurred together. More evidence surfaced: a cracked lens from a pair of glasses, likely Celine's, a button that matched Torin's shirt. Each piece felt like a heartbeat returning after years of silence. Holt brought in additional teams to scour the ridge and beyond. Naomi, now lead on site, was tireless. She hardly slept, living on coffee and quiet determination. I admired her for that, even as I worried what it was doing to her. Then came the second cave. It was smaller, deeper, hidden under layers of fallen timber about half a mile from the first. Naomi found it late on the 5th day, following a faint trail of disturbed earth down a slope. Inside, the air was colder, heavy with the smell of damp rock and decay. The beam from Holt's flashlight landed on a pile of bones near the back wall, larger this time. A torn piece of blue fabric clung to the remains. It was Torin's color. The scene suggested struggle: a shattered lantern, a knife blade snapped near the handle. Whatever happened there, it wasn't peaceful. Forensics worked through the night. The tests would later confirm what we already suspected: it was Torin. The news broke something in all of us, but especially Elise. She'd seen him as the steady one, the one who'd take care of the others. Learning he'd died first hit her harder than she could show. She thanked Holt through tears, then went home before the cameras arrived. The next morning, the focus shifted again. Holt believed there were more sites, each one marking a desperate attempt to survive. He was right. Down in a nearby ravine, the team found a collapsed lean-to and a single hiking boot small enough to be Celine's. The slope there was treacherous, and it looked like they'd tried to build shelter before part of the bank gave way. Every new find added another piece to a puzzle that only painted tragedy. That night, the storm rolled in again, drenching everything. We huddled under a tarp at base camp, the fire struggling to hold its shape in the wind. Holt spoke over the crackle voice low. "They fought to live," he said. "Every one of them. Remember that." His words stuck with me because I knew he was talking to himself as much as to us. When dawn came, the rain eased, and the valley was filled with fog so thick it erased distance. You could stand 20 feet from a man and only see his outline. We packed up quietly, the kind of quiet that comes when grief settles into routine. As we started the next climb, Naomi paused, looking back at the ridge. "You ever think," she said, "the mountain keeps what it wants?" I told her, "Yes, but sometimes it gives something back too, just enough to make you keep looking." We reached the ridgeline by noon. The clouds broke for a moment, sunlight spilling through in long, thin shafts, turning the wet ground silver. From up there, you could see for miles, endless forest broken by streaks of rock and shadow. Somewhere out in that expanse, 2 girls were still missing, and a story wasn't finished. Holt folded his map, slid it into his pocket, and started down the slope again. None of us spoke. The deeper we went, the older the air felt, like walking through layers of time. Naomi led us toward a narrow cut in the ridge where runoff formed a small creek. We followed it downhill, the sound of water guiding us. It was there, near a bend in the stream, that Holt stopped and crouched. Something was lodged under the roots, a bit of cloth, pale and waterlogged. He pulled it free and turned it over in his hand, a corner of the same orange fabric. Another reminder, another breadcrumb on a trail that seemed endless. As we marked the spot and packed up the sample, the light faded again. The air dropped to 40, our breath fogging in front of us. Naomi glanced west toward the dark line of trees. "We're close," she said. Holt didn't answer, but I saw him look down at the creek, then back toward the ridge. He had that look, the one I'd seen the first night at the station. The look of a man who knows he's following ghosts, but follows anyway. We hiked out in silence. The forest had gone completely still. Even the wind had quit. Somewhere behind us, the creek kept talking, its voice soft and endless, carrying whatever it knew down the mountain. We'd be back in the morning to follow where it led. But for that moment, standing in the half-dark with mud on my boots and the weight of the mountains pressing on my chest, I could feel it, that sense that the story was about to change again. Something waited further in, and the mountain, for reasons all its own, was finally ready to tell us more. The next morning started gray and heavy, the kind of quiet where even the ravens don't bother to call. Mist hung low in the valley, curling through the pines like smoke. We were up before dawn, boots soaked with dew, radios crackling to life one by one. Holt's voice came over first low and deliberate. "We'll follow the creek north. Stay sharp. This place likes to surprise you." It did. That mountain had a way of holding its breath until you stopped paying attention and then giving you something you'd never forget. We started our climb along the creek bed, moving slow. Naomi walked ahead of me, careful where she placed each step, eyes always scanning. The water beside us moved fast, cutting through rock and moss with that steady sound that fills the gaps in conversation. For hours we found nothing, just the remains of old storms, downed branches, stones slick with algae. Then right before noon, Naomi stopped so abruptly I nearly walked into her. She was staring at something lodged in the bank, a piece of metal half buried in the mud. Together we worked it loose. It was a small tin box, rusted shut, no bigger than a lunch pail. Holt joined us, his gloves black with soil, and after a few minutes he pried the lid open. Inside were nuggets of gold darkened from age, and folded beneath them, a yellowed page covered in tight, slanted handwriting. The name at the top stopped me cold, Calder Voss. Holt frowned, muttered something under his breath, and began reading the lines out loud. They were dated 1985, notes about mining claims, traps, and trespassers. The last entry was short. "They're coming. Must protect the gold." That name Voss jogged a memory. Back in the late 80s, there'd been talk among the old rangers about a prospector who'd gone missing in the same area. The story was that he'd come looking for a strike, then disappeared before winter. Nobody ever found his camp, just a few tools left near an abandoned shaft. At the time, most folks figured he'd died of exposure or fallen into one of his own pits. But reading those words standing in the same stretch of woods 20 years later felt like the past was whispering straight into our ears. We radioed the station and marked the coordinates. Holt's tone changed after that. It wasn't just a missing hiker case anymore. It was two tragedies overlapping decades apart. We pushed on, following the creek another half-mile until the terrain started to rise again. The air grew cooler, shadows thicker. Naomi kept glancing at the tree line, as if she expected someone to step out from behind it. Finally, the path narrowed into a small ravine, and the ground turned rocky and uneven. That's where we found the second cache, an old wooden crate wedged under a boulder, its lid split by rot. Inside, along with more tools and a rusted hammer, was another journal. The ink had bled, but you could still make out the sketches circles with pointed stakes notes about warning traps and keeping thieves away. The handwriting matched the first. It hit us all at once. The booby trap Naomi had found wasn't built by the hikers at all. It had been here long before them. Voss's work forgotten, buried, waiting. Holt stood there in silence for a long time. "They must have stumbled right into it," he said finally. 7 years after it was set. He didn't sound surprised, just tired. As the day wore on, we started noticing more signs of old activity. Cut logs a length of chain half swallowed by dirt, the faint outline of what had once been a lean-to. Voss had lived here, worked here, maybe even died here. And the more we saw, the clearer it became that Mara and her friends had unknowingly walked into a piece of history that hadn't finished telling its story. The storm hit just before sunset. Rain came down in sheets, pounding the tarp so hard we had to shout to be heard. Holt called for us to take cover under an overhang while he marked the rest of the site. The thunder rolled down the valley in long, deep groans. Between flashes of lightning, I could see Naomi sitting on a rock across from me, her face pale in the light. She was staring at the creek like she was trying to read something in its reflection. When I asked what she was thinking, she said, "They never had a chance, did they?" I didn't answer because I didn't know. That night, once the storm eased, we built a small fire and dried what we could. Holt sat apart from the rest of us, turning the Voss journal over in his hands. "You ever notice," he said quietly, "how every mountain's got its ghosts? They don't go away. They just wait for someone to trip over 'em again." Naomi looked up. "You think he killed them?" Holt shook his head. "No. He was gone long before they got here. But his traps didn't die with him." He looked back toward the dark ridge. "That's the thing about men like Voss. They keep protecting what's already taken everything from them." The next morning, we started digging near the old shaft site marked in the journal. The soil was soft from the rain, easy to move. After about an hour, one of the volunteers hit something solid, a piece of timber buried deep. We cleared around it and found the collapsed entrance to a mine tunnel. Holt knelt at the edge, shining his flashlight into the void. A rush of cold air came out, smelling of metal and time. "This is it," he said. "This is where he worked." We rigged ropes and took turns going in one at a time. I went second. The tunnel was narrow, lined with rotting beams, the floor littered with old tools and rusted cans. About 20 feet in the beam of my light, caught something glinting, a rifle propped against the wall, its barrel eaten by rust. I brushed the dirt from the stock. Carved into it were the initials CV 1982, Voss's gun. Next to it lay a cracked tin cup and a small leather pouch filled with coins stamped 1984. We went deeper, slow and deliberate. The tunnel curved slightly, ending in a small chamber. That's where we found him, or what was left of him. A skeleton partially buried under a fall of rock, a gold ring still on one finger. Beside him, another set of remains, smaller, a woman. She had a matching ring. Holt removed his hat. "Calder and Ara Voss," he said softly. "Looks like the mountain finally gave them back." It was strange standing there in that silence, realizing the man who'd caused so much unintentional harm had died just as alone as the hikers who followed. His traps had outlived him by almost 2 decades. The forest had simply carried on, no one the wiser, until fate dropped 4 kids on the wrong path. Back at camp, the reality of it began to sink in. The hikers hadn't been victims of malice or mystery. They'd been casualties of time caught in the leftover madness of a man long gone. Holt gathered the team and spoke plainly. "This is what we'll tell the families. They weren't hunted. They weren't abandoned. They just crossed a line laid down by someone they never knew existed." We all sat with that for a while. Naomi poked at the fire eyes distant. "And the gold?" she asked. Holt gave a half smile, more tired than amused. "Still here, the kind that ruins more lives than it saves." He was right. Every nugget we'd found went straight into evidence and later into a museum vault. None of it would make up for what was lost. The next few days were spent documenting, photographing, packing. The forensics team confirmed each hiker's remains Mara under a rock slide near the ravine Torin. In the second cave, Leora and Celine buried together by the creek. 4 young lives that had lasted just long enough to leave a trail of courage behind. Elise came to the site when it was safe. She didn't speak, just knelt beside the creek, touched the water, and whispered her daughter's name. When she stood, she looked at Holt and said, "Thank you for bringing her home." By the time the last evidence bag was sealed, the valley was quiet again. Holt signed off the final report and handed me a copy of the journal. "Keep it," he said. "You were here. You'll remember it right." That evening, as we packed to leave, Naomi found one last thing near the base of a tree, an old locket cracked open, but still holding a faded photo of a young woman. On the back, an engraving read, "To Calder, forever, yours, Ara." It was strange how something so small could tie it all together. I held it in my palm for a long time, feeling the weight of it. how greed and love, hope and ruin could live in the same piece of metal. We left just before sunset. The sky burned orange through the thinning clouds, the peaks catching the last light. I looked back once down at that stretch of creek and the dark mouth of the mine. Holt was still there standing alone, hat in his hands. The wind caught the pages of his notebook and flipped them once before dying down. On the drive back, the road curved through the trees, their silhouettes black against the fading sky. I couldn't stop thinking about how all of it, Voss's traps, the gold, those 4 kids had come together by accident. A tangle of time and chance and the mountain keeping score in its own quiet way. When we reached the edge of town, the radio went dead, replaced by static. I turned it off and listened to the tires on the pavement, the steady rhythm of it. The lights from Estes Park glowed faintly ahead, soft and yellow like distant lanterns. Behind us, the Rockies disappeared into shadow again, their secrets tucked back under stone and pine. I knew we'd go back one more time to finish the paperwork, to mark the graves, to give the last answers we could. But that night, as the dark closed in, it felt like the mountain was finally done speaking for now. We stayed up there another full day after the last evidence was packed. No one said it, but none of us wanted to leave just yet. The mountain had gone still again, the air heavy with that odd, respectful quiet that follows truth. Down in the ravine, the creek was running high, carrying bits of bark and ash from our fire the night before. I remember kneeling by the water, running a hand through it, and realizing it was the same current that had hidden so much, and then returned it, piece by piece, bones, cloth, gold answers. Holt stood a few yards away with his hat off, looking toward the slope where we'd found the grave. It wasn't ceremony exactly, but it felt like one. He didn't speak. None of us did. Sometimes silence is the only honest language left. When the helicopters came for the final extraction, Elise was waiting back at the ranger station. She'd aged 10 years in the week since we started bringing her daughter home. Her hair was streaked silver, her hands never quite still. When Holt laid the evidence folders in front of her photos, timelines, maps, she asked only one question: "Did she fight?" He nodded. All of them did. That was enough. She closed the file without looking at the pictures, pressed her palm over the cover, and said quietly, "Then she died, the way she lived." I'll never forget that line. It wasn't relief, not forgiveness either, but something closer to peace, the kind that doesn't erase grief, only gives it a place to stand. The official report closed the case as accidental deaths tied to environmental exposure compounded by man-made hazards from an abandoned mining site. It sounded clinical, but that's what the record required. The state sealed off the ravine permanently. Warning signs went up at both trailheads, and rangers dismantled every remaining trap we could find. The artifacts, the gold, the tools, the journals, went to a small exhibit at the local museum under a glass case labeled The Lost Claim. Visitors pass by it now without knowing what it cost. The coins gleam under artificial light, neat and safe, but every time I see them, I remember what the mountain looked like under storm clouds, how it held its treasure tight, while 4 lives slipped away trying to survive its shadow. Naomi stayed on with the service another few years. She became one of the best search leads we ever had. Steady, methodical, unshakable. She told me once that this case was the reason she learned to trust her instincts, not her comfort. We still talk every Christmas. Holt retired the next spring. The job had taken most of his hearing, and I think the last bit of faith that nature always plays fair. He moved down to Pueblo, bought a small house near the river, and spent his days fishing. When I called him last year, his voice was softer, slower. "You ever think about them?" I asked. He said, "Every time it rains." That was the end of it. As for me, I stayed with search and rescue another decade. I thought distance and time might dull the edges, but the truth is it never does. Cases like this one settle in the bones. They change the way you move through quiet places. Even now, when I hike near Bear Lake, I catch myself counting steps, listening for echoes that aren't there. The mountain is beautiful again. Trails, repaired wildflowers blooming where our tents once stood. But it's not innocent. Beauty rarely is, once you've seen what it can hide. A few months after the investigation closed, I drove up alone one morning with 4 small wooden markers I'd carved by hand. Nothing official, just their names burned into pine: Mara Kensington, Leora Finch, Celine Carver, Torrin Hale. I planted them near the edge of the creek, where the last of the evidence had washed out. It wasn't about claiming a grave, it was about giving the place a voice. By noon, the sun had broken through the clouds, catching the water just right so that it looked gold for a moment. I remember thinking how strange it was that the same light could fall on everything good and cruel without choosing sides. The community held a memorial that fall. Small crowd, mostly locals and family. The Ranger Service provided a folded flag, and the mayor read a statement about loss and perseverance. Elise spoke last. Her voice was steady. She thanked the searchers, then turned toward the crowd and said, "People think closure is something you get. It's not. It's something you make out of whatever's left." Then she sat down, and that was the end of the ceremony. No applause, no song, just the wind moving through the aspens. Years later, hikers started leaving small tokens by the creek ribbons, stones, sketches of wildflowers. Some carved initials into the wooden bridge nearby. One day, I found a new note wedged under a rock written in careful handwriting: "Thank you for finding them." No name, just that. It struck me that the story had stopped belonging to any one of us. It had become something larger, a reminder passed quietly from stranger to stranger about how easily the wilderness can take and how hard it is to bring anything back. Every now and then, reporters still reach out asking for details that never made the file: the human parts, the mistakes, the moments. I turn them down. The record says enough. What matters more is what those 4 did with the time they had. They didn't give up. Even hurt and lost, they built traps to protect themselves, carved markings to count the days, tried to write their story before it ended. That's courage most people never get tested on. The Voss claim is still sealed. The entrance sits behind a reinforced gate, now locked and welded a steel plate with a plaque mounted beside it. Dedicated to all who sought the mountain's promise and paid its price. I go there once a year in early summer when the snowmelt feeds the streams and the air smells of pine resin and rain. The hike is quiet, just the crunch of gravel underfoot and the soft hum of wind through the canyon. When I reach the gate, I brush away the dust from their names, say them out loud, and listen to how the sound travels before fading into the trees. People ask sometimes if I believe in curses. I don't. I believe in history, the kind buried under dirt until someone steps on it. Voss left his traps for greed. The mountain kept them for memory. And in the end, both were still there waiting for the wrong footsteps. There's no moral to that, no divine balance, just the truth that everything left unburied eventually comes back one way or another. When the case was finally archived, Holt sent me a short note. It said, "We did right by them. That's enough." He was right, I think. We can't fix what was lost, but we can honor the ones who tried to live. I've learned that's the best any of us can do. The mountain taught me that survival isn't always winning. Sometimes it's just refusing to disappear. It's been over 20 years now. The new rangers who patrol those trails weren't even alive when it happened. They know the story only as a file number, a cautionary tale about weather maps and luck. That's fine. Maybe that's how it should be. Every generation inherits its own silence to break. But on certain evenings when the light turns that same dull gold and the trees stand motionless against the ridge, I swear the air feels heavier, like the mountain is remembering too. I never remarried after my wife passed. These days it's mostly quiet mornings and coffee that's too strong. But every so often I pull the map from that summer out of my drawer. The paper's soft from age edges, curled red grease pencil marks, fading to pink. Each line tells the story of where we searched and where we finally found them. It's not a map of loss anymore. It's a map of persistence, of people who refused to stop looking even when the trail vanished. I fold it carefully and slide it back into the envelope. Then I step out onto the porch, breathe in that clean Colorado air, and let the quiet settle. Out there somewhere beyond the timberline, the creek is still moving over stone. The traps are gone, the gold locked away, but the story lingers not as tragedy, but as testimony. 4 young hikers, a prospector, a mountain that held too much, and those of us left to tell it. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark.